Ladies and gents, welcome back to another video. Today, we've got an iPod Touch 5th generation. This one should be running iOS 6 and it's never been updated. So let's get this thing opened up, see what we've got, and then talk about the iPod Touch that Apple launched in 2012 with iOS 6. Let's begin. And here it is. It is in the gorgeous blue color. This is probably my favorite color of the 5th gen iPod Touch. You can tell it's definitely a 5th gen not only by the color, but because it has the little lanyard loop down here, which you can push in and out. Unfortunately, no lanyard with this one. We did just get the iPod, but this one's in very nice condition. The frame of the device might have a few scratches. There appears to be a little bit of a scuff mark there at the top. The front of the display looks very nice. It's a little dirty. Let me see if I can give that a bit of a clean. Okay, and there you guys can see just how this looks. We might have, oh no, it's just some dust. Looks like there might be a few small scratches on the display, but no cracks and certainly no deeper scratches or grooves. Moment of truth, let's see if this thing has any power. I will be a bit surprised. Oh, and it does. Wow, okay. This thing's been sitting in my closet for like probably 4 months now. I am just now getting around to opening it up. And this thing still has power. That's actually a really good sign. That means we could have a very strong battery in one of these, and battery life is not a strong suit for the iPod Touch. So let's see what happens here. We do have that old style Apple logo, as you can see, which means we do have iOS 6. Let's wait for this thing to boot. And there we go. Here we are at the iOS 6 lock screen. There's actually quite a few applications, looks like mostly games on this iPod Touch. So let's see what we've got. I'll go ahead and click through these folders. We got a flashlight app. These appear to be all stock applications. Same remote. I think it's an Apple app, but you do have to add it later on. Here's some games. Cut the Rope, Angry Birds. Those are good ones that I used to play. I've heard of those too. And here we've got a bunch of random things. I played Lego Star Wars way back in the day on the computer. And then we've got Subway Surfer. That's a classic as well. Here's some more default Apple apps and a few more games there. And then of course we've got those two games. So what I want to do, I'm actually going to reset the home screen layout, and iOS 9.3 has been downloaded and ready to install. I don't want that. That's actually an interesting version. That shows you how long ago the owner of this iPod stopped using it, because it was before the last version of iOS 9 came out. But let me reset the home screen layout. And battery's pretty low. Let's see if we can see what iOS version we have. So this is 6.1.3, and it is a 32 gig model. Very nice. And we've got, of course, some applications, bunch of photos, a few videos, and some songs on here. So this thing looks to be pretty loaded with media. Let me go ahead and charge this just a little bit so it doesn't die on us, and then we will do a brief review on this iPod Touch here in 2025. This one is still running iOS 6. All right, the iPod's been on the charger for close to an hour, and here it is. So let's go ahead and talk about this thing just a little bit. Obviously, it's running iOS 6. That's what it came with when it launched in 2012. Now, this was a big update for the iPod Touch when it came out. It improved on a lot of different areas, probably the most important of which was the internal performance. This thing now has a dual-core A5 CPU. It is running at 800 megahertz, and it has vastly improved graphics over the A4 chip that it replaced in the iPod Touch 4th gen. We also got an improved display. This is now a 4-inch panel, similar to that found on the iPhone 5, which launched similarly. I forget if they were launched at the same time, but they both came out in fall of 2012, and they share a very similar design. This iPod Touch is also incredibly thin. It is thinner than the 4th gen, and it is much thinner than the iPhone 5. Apart from the iPod Nano 7th gen, and maybe some other iPod Nanos, and the iPad Pro with the M4 chip, this is one of the thinnest Apple products of all time. It is certainly one of the thinnest iOS devices. Now, this was the first, and I repeat, the first Apple product to feature a camera bump. As you can see there, it is itty bitty, a little tiny bump there on the back, but this was the very first Apple product to have a camera bump because this device was so thin. Speaking of the camera, this was another huge improvement over the 4th gen iPod Touch. This is now a 5 megapixel lens, I believe this can shoot 1080p video. It can definitely shoot 720, but it was a big improvement over the 0.7 megapixel lens that the iPod Touch 4th Gen had. The front-facing camera, I believe, did not see an improvement. I think it's still a 0.3 megapixel, so quality there is pretty bad for taking photos, but for FaceTime, it's probably just fine. This was also the first iPod Touch to feature that lightning connector down there at the bottom. As you can see, the 4th Gen and every iPod Touch before it had the 30-pin cable you can see here on the 3GS. This iPod came in a bunch of different colors. Some of the ones I can remember off the top of my head are blue, silver, yellow, and I think there was a pink as well. I believe actually there also was a slate black and space gray. That one is pretty clean, probably a close second. I don't remember if there was a product red for the iPod Touch 5th Gen. I know there was for the 6th and 7th Gen. I can't quite remember if the 5th Gen iPod had a product red. Now, I mentioned before that I was surprised that this thing had any power. That's because the iPod Touch batteries have always been lower quality compared to the iPhones. You'll notice that this does not have battery percentage, and if we head into settings, typically in iOS 6, that would be under the usage tab, but there's no place to turn on battery percentage. That's because iPod Touches, all except the 7th Gen, do not support battery percentage because the battery inside of these is not capable of reporting detailed enough information about its voltage to the iOS system for it to accurately represent what the battery percentage is on this device. Keep in mind that iPhones all the way back to the 3GS, which is 2 years older than this iPod Touch, actually 3 years, I believe, even the 3GS had battery percentage, and obviously every iPhone since has had that, but only the iPod Touch 7th Gen would get that feature, and it is a result of Apple using lower quality batteries. So that's a very long-winded way of me saying that the batteries in these do not hold up very well over time, and typically you'll find that older iPod Touches will last anywhere from 5 minutes to maybe 30 minutes at most. So the fact that this thing still had a charge when I turned it on after it had been sitting for months is a very good sign that this thing still has a very strong battery. And you can see it has not worked its way down yet. It is around 80 to 90% there. So I'm very happy to see that. So the 5th Gen did a lot for the iPod Touch, and the biggest of which, in my opinion, was the performance internally as well as iOS software support. So keep in mind, the iPod Touch 4th Gen that this thing replaced would get its last iOS update on iOS 6, which is what this one's running. And that is what this thing came with. So this thing would get, obviously, the iOS 6 update. It would get iOS 7, which it performed really well on. Getting one of these on iOS 7 is actually a real treat because of how it looks, and the performance on it's actually very nice. After that, it would get iOS 8, which is where this thing started to slow down, and it finished on iOS 9, which is actually pretty laggy on one of these. The A5 CPU was really pushing its limits there on iOS 9 on all the devices that supported it. It's too bad Apple didn't add the A6 chip inside of this that was found in the iPhone 5, because that thing is a lot better. And even on iOS 10, where the iPhone 5 support, that thing still feels very smooth. I think a big reason for that is the 1 gigabyte of memory you could find there in the iPhone 5 versus here on the iPod Touch 5th Gen and the iPhone 4S and the iPad 2. And every device that has the basic A5 CPU only has a half gigabyte. So a big difference there. And I think if this thing had seen the A6 chip, its legacy would have been quite a bit better than it was. That said, this iPod Touch sold really well. It came in 32 and 64 gigabyte capacities. At launch, there actually was a 16 gigabyte capacity added later on, and then there was even a different variant without the rear camera and no lanyard. It was a gray model. It was launched later on in the cycle. I believe those actually do have iOS 6 on them if you can find one that's never been updated, but most of those came out later with iOS 7. This thing feels really smooth here on iOS 6, and it looks fantastic. I mean, I'm able to fly through all the settings here. There are no slowdowns and no stutterings, even with Control Center there being full of notifications. So very smooth device. Now, one thing I want to do here is I want to record a video. So this is going to be 5 megapixels. I don't know if it's 1080p, but it is going to be 30 FPS. We'll go ahead and switch over to that right now. So here we are on the iPod Touch. It's going to be a little shaky. There's no optical image stabilization, and the resolution is going to be kind of low as well. So we'll see how this looks and how it sounds. But based on what I can tell, the colors look a little different. It's actually quite a bit shakier than my main setup. So recording video on one of these back in 2012 was just fine, but here in 2025, this thing is definitely not what you want to be recording your main videos on. Let's go ahead and switch back to the main setup. All right, so there you guys got to see and hear how the iPod Touch 5th Gen records video. It actually looks pretty nice, and we'll go ahead and snap a quick photo there with its 5 megapixel lens. So overall, I really like the iPod Touch 5th Gen. I think it's a great device. Finding one on iOS 6 is incredibly difficult. Most people that got these kept them for some years, and obviously they would see software updates as you held on to it, and that's why finding one of these on iOS 6 is such a challenge. And with all that said, that's going to conclude this video. I hope you enjoyed taking a look here at an iPod Touch 5th Gen, specifically in the blue color that's never been updated. This thing is still running iOS 6 just like it was in 2012 when it came out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, I look forward to seeing you in another one of my videos.